In the winter of 1935, a camera crew filmed a few seconds of a striped, dog-shaped animal pacing behind wire mesh, its jaw dropping open in a way that looks almost unnatural. Nobody who watched that footage knew they were looking at one of the last of its kind. That reel sat forgotten in an archive for 8 to 5 years. And when it finally resurfaced, it did something strange to the people who study this animal for a living. It didn't just make them sad. It made them start asking a question they weren't supposed to still be asking. What if the story we've been telling about this animal's extinction is wrong? That animal is a thylacine, commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger, and for almost 90 years the world has treated its ending as settled history. One date, one place, one cause of death. But a growing body of careful, peer-reviewed research is now suggesting that ending might be a myth we built to make ourselves feel better about looking away too soon. Stay with me, because this isn't a story about cryptids in the bush or blurry photographs sold to tabloids. It's a story about what happens when scientists stop trusting the neat version of events and start trusting the math instead. And the math is telling a story that should unsettle anyone who thought this case was closed. Let's begin with a version everyone thinks they know. On the night of the 6th into the 7th of September, 1936, at a modest zoo in Hobart, the capital of the Australian island of Tasmania, the last known thylacine on the planet died. The animal had reportedly been shut out of its heated sleeping quarters during an unusually cold snap, left exposed on bare concrete through a freezing night, and was found dead by keepers the next morning. For decades, the animal was remembered as an old male nickname Benjamin. It's a detail that appears in nature documentaries, museum placards, and 1,000 articles online. It is also, we now know, almost certainly false. Historical researchers who tracked down the surviving Hobart Zoo records in recent years found no contemporary use of that name at all, and physical evidence points to the animal actually having been female. The nickname appears to have been grafted onto the story sometime later, and repeated so often it calcified into fact. Even the identity of the supposedly final, most documented animal on Earth turns out to have been a myth hiding in plain sight for most of a century. That's unsettling on its own. But it's a small crack compared to what comes next. Because the date September 7th, 1936 isn't just a sad footnote. It became a monument. Australia now observes that date every year as National Threatened Species Day, a deliberate act of national memory meant to stop future extinctions before they happen. And there's a bitter irony buried in the choice of that particular date, because just 59 days before that lonely animal died in Hobart, the Tasmanian government had finally granted the species legal protection. After roughly a century of organized killing, the law showed up 9 weeks too late to save anyone. It protected an animal that had, for all practical purposes, already run out of time. To understand how a population goes from thousands of animals to zero in a single human lifetime, you have to understand what this creature actually was, because almost everything about its common name is a mistake. It was not a tiger. It wasn't related to tigers at all. European settlers looked at the dark bands across its lower back, noticed the sharp teeth in its long snout, and reached for the most fearsome striped animal they could think of. What they were actually looking at was a marsupial, part of the same broad family tree as kangaroos, wombats, and possums, and in fact the largest carnivorous marsupial to survive into the modern era. Its scientific name, Thylacine cynocephalus, translates roughly to pouched dog head, and had a far more honest description. From a distance, in poor light, it moved and hunted like a mid-sized dog. Up close, the illusion collapsed completely. Both males and females carried a pouch, an anatomical trait dogs simply don't have, with a female's pouch opening backward toward the tail instead of forward. Its tail wasn't a dog's tail either. It was thick and rigid at the base, tapering to a stiff point, held out behind the body almost like a fifth limb, more like a kangaroo's counterbalance than anything canine. Then there was a jaw. Watch the surviving footage of a thylacine in captivity, and at some point it will do the thing that made this species famous. It opens its mouth to an almost impossible angle, somewhere around 80 degrees, among the widest gapes ever measured in any mammal. It's the detail people remember most, the one that made this animal look like a monster in old photographs. And that's precisely why what comes next is so important. Despite that terrifying gape, studies of thylacine skulls show the jaw itself was narrow and mechanically weak, built for gripping small, soft-bodied prey like possums, birds, and young wallabies. It was not, by any reasonable biomechanical measure, an animal capable of routinely killing full-grown sheep. which matters enormously, because killing sheep is exactly what it was accused of, tried for, and ultimately exterminated over. The thylacine wasn't even originally a Tasmanian animal in the way most people assume. Fossil evidence shows it once ranged across mainland Australia and New Guinea, a widespread predator woven into ecosystems across an entire continent. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, it disappeared from the mainland entirely, most likely outcompeted by the dingo, a more social pack hunter that arrived from the north and never made it across to Tasmania, which had already been cut off by rising sea levels. Isolated from that competition, the thylacine held on in Tasmania's cold, wet interior. By the time British colonists arrived in 1803 and began carving sheep farms out of that landscape, an estimated 5,000 thylacines were still moving through the island's forests. 5,000 animals that had survived ice ages and the loss of an entire continent, about to encounter something far more efficient at ending species than any dingo ever was. The killing was organized, funded, and eventually run by the government itself. In 1830, a powerful pastoral company operating in Tasmania's northwest began paying a bounty for every dead thylacine, blaming it for losses among its sheep flocks. The evidence for that blame was thin. Wild dogs, disease, harsh weather, and poor farming practices in unfamiliar terrain almost certainly killed far more livestock, and thylacines that scavenged an already dead carcass were frequently blamed for a kill they never made. In 1888, the Tasmanian government made the persecution official policy, offering a payment for every adult killed and a smaller payment for every pup. Over the 21 years that bounty scheme ran, more than 2,000 payments were recorded, and that number reflects only the kills people bothered to report and claim, out of a starting population already measured in the thousands. Hunting alone might not have finished the job. Around the 1890s, something else appears to have moved through the surviving population, a wasting illness, described in old records as animals turning up dead with no visible wounds, or thin, mangy, and weak before dying. Researchers now suspect a disease similar to canine distemper, likely introduced by the settlers' own dogs, sweeping through a population that had already been thinned and fragmented by decades of bounty hunting. A healthy, abundant species can usually absorb a disease outbreak. A species already bleeding from a price on its head cannot. By the time the government bounty program ended in 1909, trappers who had once caught several thylacines a season were coming back from the bush empty-handed. The animal that had ranged across the island interior for millennia had become, within a few human generations, almost impossible to find. The last confirmed kill of a wild thylacine took place in 1930, when a Tasmanian farmer shot one near his property after finding it prowling close to his land. A photograph exists of him afterward, holding the animal by its stiff tail, an ordinary man documenting what he believed was an ordinary bit of pest control. As far as the official record shows, no wild thylacine was ever reliably confirmed again after that day. 6 years later came the final capture. A trapper caught a live thylacine in a snare in the Tasmanian bush and sold it to the Hobart Zoo, where it lived out its final months as the last known individual of its species, eventually dying on that cold September night in 1936. Here is a number worth sitting with. Across the entire recorded history of this species, from the earliest motion picture cameras through its extinction, the total surviving film footage of a living thylacine amounts to roughly 3 minutes. Not 3 minutes per year, or per decade. 3 minutes total, mostly shot at the Hobart Zoo between 1928 and 1935, silent, black and white, grainy, and in every single frame, only ever one animal alone behind wire. Never a pair, never a family. Just a solitary creature pacing a concrete enclosure, unaware that it was the last visual record his entire lineage would ever leave behind. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because in May of 2020, Australia's National Film Archive released 21 seconds of thylacine footage that no living person had ever seen before. It had been shot in 1935 and then buried for 8 to 5 years inside a tourism promotional film about Tasmania, discovered only when archivists went back through old reels looking for exactly this kind of overlooked material. Watching it, you are looking at an animal that had already been dead for 8 to 4 years by the time anyone laid eyes on the footage. It is, in the most literal sense, haunting, a ghost captured on celluloid decades before anyone knew to grieve it, sitting in a drawer the whole time, waiting. That rediscovery didn't just move documentary editors and animal lovers. It reignited something in the scientific community, a renewed, very serious interest in going back through every scrap of evidence connected to this animal's disappearance, including the thousands of reported sightings that had piled up in the decades after 1936 and were largely dismissed by the mainstream scientific consensus. That renewed interest led, in 2023, to one of the most rigorous statistical investigations ever conducted into a modern extinction. A research team based at the University of Tasmania, working with collaborators in the UK, the US, and France, compiled an exhaustive database of more than 1,200 reported thylacine sightings recorded between 1910 and the present day, each one carefully rated for reliability based on who reported it, how detailed the description was, and how plausible the location and circumstances were. They then applied statistical extinction date estimation methods, the same type of mathematical tools used by conservation biologists to study the disappearance of species like the dodo and the ivory-billed woodpecker, tools built specifically to handle noisy, uncertain sighting records and extract the most probable true extinction date hidden inside them. The logic behind these models is fairly intuitive once you hear it explained. A species that is genuinely still alive but simply hard to find tends to generate sightings that, while inconsistent, taper off gradually and cluster in plausible habitat, often reported by people with genuine expertise, like foresters, park rangers, and field biologists. A species that is truly extinct, on the other hand, tend to generate a short burst of sightings right after its presumed disappearance, driven by grief and heightened attention, followed by sightings that quickly become sparse, low quality, and easily explained by misidentification. By modeling the actual shape and quality distribution of the sighting record over time, researchers can estimate, with defined statistical confidence, the most probable point at which the real signal of the surviving population faded into pure noise. What the 2023 study found was genuinely surprising, and it's important to state clearly and carefully what it actually claims. The model did not conclude that thylacines are alive today. It concluded that the most probable true extinction date for the species falls somewhere between the 1980s and the early 2000s, roughly 50 to 70 years later than the officially recognized 1936 date. The paper specifically highlighted a cluster of unusually credible sightings from the decades following the 1930s, including detailed reports from trained wildlife officers and researchers who knew the local fauna intimately, sightings concentrated in the remote, densely forested wilderness of Tasmania's southwest, terrain so rugged and untrivial that a small, wary population could plausibly have gone unnoticed by casual observers for generations. The frequency of plausible reports held roughly steady through the middle decades of the 20th century and then dropped off sharply after the year 2000, a pattern the researchers argued is far more consistent with a slowly dwindling remnant population finally blinking out than with pure, random misidentification continuing at a constant rate indefinitely, though it's worth being honest about how contested this remains, because responsible science means holding on to that uncertainty rather than flattening it into a clean answer. Other researchers, including some of the very scientists who pioneered these extinction date models, have pushed back on aspects of the methodology, arguing that sighting databases are inherently messy and that even sophisticated statistical treatments can be skewed by a handful of unverifiable reports. The most prominent skeptic in this field has spent decades personally investigating alleged thylacine sightings and has traced the overwhelming majority of them to a much more common Tasmanian animal, the pademelon, a small wallaby that, glimpsed briefly at night in a car's headlights or under dense forest canopy, can produce a surprisingly convincing silhouette. Sincere witnesses, bad lighting, and an animal people desperately want to see again turn out to be a powerful combination for generating false positives, and no serious researcher in this space claims otherwise.